Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our congressional briefing, Black Lives Matter, Social Work and the Future of Policing. I am Charles E. Lewis Jr., and I will be your host and moderator for today's panel. This briefing is being sponsored in conjunction with the Congressional Social Work Caucus chaired by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, along with the offices of Congresswoman Karen Bass and Senator Chris Van Hollen. We have a hashtag for today, social work underscore policing. So if you're on Twitter or Instagram, you can use that hashtag. We also will have a email address for those who want to make comments following this program, socialwork.policing@gmail.com. Before we get started, we have opening greetings from Senator Van Hollen of the great state of Maryland, followed by a message from Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
Charles, the senator may not be available right now. Should we play the Congresswoman's video first?
Please.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and I represent California's beautiful 13th Congressional District. Yes, the most enlightened district in the nation. I want to welcome you all to today's virtual briefing entitled Black Lives Matter, Social Work, and the Future of Policing. Today's briefing is sponsored by the Center for Social Development at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, the National Association of Social Workers, and the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy. Our country is in the midst of grappling with systemic police violence and the murder of countless black and brown men and women by police, and also how we move forward as a country. A part of the answer should be using the tools already at our disposal. And that includes thinking about how social workers who are trained in social problem solving can be more effective in nonviolent situations. Most Americans now understand that the United States should stop
Senator, you are now
racialized
joining.
killings by police. It is time for major change. As
Hi,
a
it's Chris
psychiatric
Van
social
Hollen
worker
joining
by
by
profession,
audio.
I know the social.
Hello?
Senator, can you give us 2 minutes? We are playing a video and then you will be on.
Oh, sure. Unfortunately, I couldn't do the video part, so I'll be audio only, okay? Thanks.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Social work values and skills are far more appropriate and effective in these situations than the use of force. Social workers are guided by community decision making to encourage culturally appropriate, community based solutions on issues ranging from homelessness and mental health issues to nonviolent disturbances, nonviolent crimes, and management of crowds. The policing crisis facing our country has caused untold trauma among generations of young black and brown children. Although legal separation may have ended years ago, systemic racism permeates every facet of our society. It's in everything: police murders, health disparities, unequal education, poor housing, income inequality, lack of clean water in black communities, the wage gap, the wealth gap, why 40% of black businesses have permanently gone out of business compared to approximately 19% of white businesses during this terrible pandemic. From slavery through the black codes, lynching, segregation, mass incarceration, and many more despicable historical moments in this country's history, Enough is enough. Systemic racism is prevalent in every aspect of this country, and as members of Congress, we must add a racial lens to all of our decisions. We make public policy decisions that could deepen systemic racism or begin to break the chains that still exist in every Black person's life. So I thank you all for being here today to take part in these important discussions to find ways to hopefully, finally, end the generations of trauma which our Black communities are facing. Thank you all again, and stay healthy.
Senator Van Hollen?
Yes, Dr. Lewis, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to, first of all, thank you. I want to thank Chris for co-hosting the gathering. Thanks also to the Center for Social Development at the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University and to the National Association of Social Workers. I'm honored to join you today and the panelists and participants. I wish I could be on video, but my technology didn't connect me, but I'm pleased to have a chance to say a few words at this moment of reckoning for our country. And I think we are all united in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many other Black lives taken before, that we've got to take action for real change on police accountability, but also to root out systemic racism in all our institutions in all its ugly forms. On policing, we do need to pass the Justice in Policing Act. But I believe we need to go beyond that, and that's why I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words. I think we need to make structural changes in the way we respond to emergency calls, because in way too many instances, we are deploying police to respond to incidents where it would be much more appropriate and better for all to be dispatching social workers. And I want to thank all of the social workers on the line for all that they do to work with people to try to solve real life problems in a way that benefits the individuals, the families, and the whole community. That's why I am teaming up with Congresswoman Karen Bass. We will be introducing legislation called the Community-Based Emergency Response Act. And the idea is to create an alternative response in cases where we're dealing with disturbances caused by homelessness or mental health issues, or all of the thousands of other situations where there's not a crime involved, where it's not a violent situation, and where it doesn't require a police response. Because too often when we have police respond to these kinds of situations, we've witnessed an unnecessary escalation, and that escalation has led to abuse, and as we've said, tragically, death. And so our proposal, which we plan to introduce very soon, would essentially set up a federal grant program for local jurisdictions that establish this alternative response, so that when somebody calls 911 for emergency, the operator is trained to very quickly determine whether it's a violent situation where a police response would be necessary, a police response, I should say, governed by the Justice in Policing Act accountability provisions. That's why that is so important. But we want to create an alternative system that can be used for the other hundreds of incidents that don't endanger anybody's risk, except for do have the risk of escalation if police respond. And so we would establish a robust federal grant program that would go to communities on a competitive basis that put forward the kind of proposals that we're talking about for an alternative emergency response, deploy social workers and others who are trained to deal with so many of these other situations, so we don't have unnecessary escalation, mistreatment, and even death, as we've seen. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. We look forward to working with all of you as we also, as we put accountability in place for police response, that we also change the system. And we also, of course, need to do work in many other realms, including healthcare and education and housing. But we think this is an important step in the area of systemic change to how we deploy our resources in communities.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen, and thank you, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. So today you're going to hear from 4 very skilled and knowledgeable social workers who are working or researching in the area of community policing. But before I introduce them, I would like to highlight one critical issue as we begin the discussion. We're here because Ahmaud Aubrey, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, and many others have died at the hands of police officers. And so we want to look at how we can find an alternative to engaging police officers in certain situations. According to the Treatment Advocacy Center, about a third of the 8.3 million Americans with severe mental illness have their first contact with mental health treatment through an encounter with law enforcement. 1 in 4 individuals killed by police have a severe mental illness: bipolar, schizophrenia, major depression. The risk of being killed during a police incident is 16 times greater for people with severe mental illness than for other civilians. Social workers are by far the largest provider of mental health services in the United States. These facts alone make the case for greatly expanding roles for social workers in addressing nonviolent community disturbances. So we're going to begin by hearing from Dr. George Patterson, an associate professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College in New York. Dr. Patterson is a police social worker and has written extensively about social work and policing. Following Dr. Patterson will be Dr. Carrie Pettis Davis, associate professor and founding director of the Institute for Justice and Development at Florida State University School of Social Work. Dr. Pettis Davis is also a co-lead for the Smart Decarceration Network of the 12 Grand Challenges for Social Work. He will be followed by Sheriff Derek Jackson, a social worker and director of the Office of Community Engagement for the Washtenaw County, Michigan Sheriff's Department. Last but certainly not least will be Dr. Desmond Patton, an associate professor and associate dean for academic affairs at Columbia University School of Social Work. Dr. Patton is the founding director of Safe Lab and focuses on social media. So we'll begin, Dr. Patterson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Senator Van Hollen, Congresswoman Bass, Congresswoman Lee, as well as CSD, NASW, and CRISP for the opportunity to provide remarks on Black Lives Matter, social work and the future of policing. As a police social worker, I always welcome the opportunity to raise the profile of professional police social work practice. This afternoon, I will limit my remarks to describe police social work. First, I will briefly describe the origins of police social work and social work employment in police departments. Next, I will discuss my own police social work practice experience and current research, and finally conclude with several recommendations for future directions. Recent commentary has suggested that the police are increasingly being called upon to respond to social problems. From the time that American police departments were first established, the majority of police work has always comprised responding to social problems. In fact, Some estimates suggest that as much as 80% of police work involves social problems and only 20% involves crime. In an effort to address this fact, more than 100 years ago, in 1919, August Vollmer, a well-known policing reformer, delivered a speech to the International Association of Chiefs of Police. The title of the speech was, "The Policeman as a Social Worker." In the speech, Vollmer urged police officers to collaborate with social service and community-based agencies to perform social service. Scholars who have studied the speech suggest that it is as controversial today as it was 100 years ago. To put the speech in perspective, World War I had just ended 1 year earlier in 1918. World War II did not begin until 1939, 20 years after Vollmer's speech. There are a few very interesting points that were made in the speech. First, Vollmer recognized that police officers had little interest or time to perform social service. Second, Vollmer introduced the concepts of social police work and police social work when referring to officers performing social service. My assessment of the speech is that Vollmer was urging officers to utilize social work knowledge and skills to perform social service. He was not advocating that police departments hire social workers. Little did he know that within 33 years after his speech, we would see the first published description of a civilian social worker employed in a police department. Also, little did he know that his concept of police social work would evolve into a specialized field of professional social work practice used to refer to social workers who are employed in police departments. And I am certainly sure that he had no idea that the FBI would hire more than 100 clinical social workers. Some of the well-known social problems in which police social workers respond to include mental health crises, domestic or interpersonal violence, and child abuse and neglect. In my own police social work practice experience, additional social problems included homelessness, alcohol and substance use and abuse, homicide, suicide, sexual assault, teen runaways, missing persons, bank and store robberies, landlord-tenant disputes, victims of crime, welfare checks, and healthcare needs, as well as elder abuse, only to mention a few. This is not an exhaustive list. A few further remarks about my own experience is that as a police social worker and certified mediator and arbitrator, I would arrive at the scene of a dispute for neighbors within moments of a 911 call in an unmarked police vehicle. Some neighbors would resolve their dispute during the single intervention. Others required follow-up intervention, and still others required a referral to a dispute settlement center for intervention. As this brief example shows, there is no single outcome for intervention. A few remarks about my current research. It took me quite a while to locate an actual copy of Vollmer's speech that was made 100 years ago. Last year, to commemorate the 100 years since the speech was given, I obtained a copy of the speech and served as guest editor for a policing journal to publish research papers for a special issue on the topic of police social work and social service collaboration. Together with my colleague, our research paper contribution consisted of a systematic review titled Police Social Work and Social Service Collaboration, 100 Years After Vollmer. We found documented police social work collaborations in 18 countries. Referral, collaboration, and counseling were the most commonly performed tasks. The most frequently addressed social problems were domestic violence or interpersonal violence, mental health crises, and crime. Crisis intervention team programs, or CIT, that are developed to address mental health crises were the most commonly name brand collaborations that we found. Based on our research, several recommendations specific to police social work practice are offered. First, More funding is needed for police social workers and behavioral health care providers that respond to 911 emergencies. I was so excited to hear Senator Van Hollen mention that he and his colleagues are working on legislation to address this very need. Second, a need exists to develop models for intervention that address the wide range of social problems that come to the attention of 911. And finally, research and evaluation are needed to assess whether these models are effective. Several schools of social work have already begun innovative policing initiatives, such as the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, the School of Health and Human Services at St. Cloud University in Minnesota, the Center for Social Development at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and USC, only to mention a few. In conclusion, Senator and Representatives, thank you again for this opportunity to provide remarks this afternoon. It has been a real pleasure to inform you about the practice of professional police social work. Social work knowledge and skills are once again at the forefront of reimagining and rethinking American policing more than 100 years after the words police social work were first spoken. One difference is that this time, now we have social workers with applied knowledge and skills acquired from employment in paramilitary police departments and police academies. Dr. Lewis?
Thank you. Before we hear from Dr. Pettis Davis, I was in my haste to get to this wonderful panel. I neglected to give you a few things. So you can type your questions in the chat box. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of their presentations. Also, this briefing is being recorded and will be available on the sponsors' websites following the briefing. There are no continuing education credits available for today's briefing. And finally, the views of our panelists are solely their own and do not reflect necessarily the views of the sponsoring organizations or congressional offices. So please type your questions in and we will get to them, as many of them as we can, following these presentations. Dr. Pettis Davis.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I'm thrilled to be here today and a part of this very prestigious panel. So thank you for the invitation and to everybody who made this possible. So I want to today focus on 4 concrete policy recommendations that I think should be given consideration because based on my work and research and experience in the field, I believe if we adopted these policy approaches that would help to ameliorate violence and to improve racial equity in our communities. So a lot of my work and our work at the Institute for Justice Research and Development has focused on trauma treatment for citizens or individuals involved in the justice system. But for my first policy recommendation, I want to suggest that social workers help to treat trauma among law enforcement officers. One of the things that we know is that law enforcement officers are exposed to and experience a significant amount of trauma while they are doing their job. The problem with this, in addition to just being exposed to lots of violence, is that untreated trauma symptoms lead to impulsivity, aggression, and misappraisals of threats of violence. So if you combine those factors with structural racism that occurs throughout our communities, you can quickly see situations turning from an opportunity to de-escalation to violence instead. So I think that one of our important next steps is to make sure that our officers are getting trauma treatment and mental health assessments and treatment that are needed. The second policy approach that I would suggest is that federal funding that is passed down to local jurisdictions for law enforcement should require uniform training and accreditation standards and licensing standards for law enforcement. And these trainings that I want to suggest also are areas that social work has expertise in and I believe could help. So because law enforcement officers are typically the first responders to a range of situations, they need to have knowledge that many of us social workers also have. They need training in human behavior, understanding humans, how they interact in certain contexts and environments. In mental health and substance abuse, part of a tradition that has been strong collaborations with social work and police in the past. They need understanding how trauma impacts individuals, how institutionalized racism impacts the likelihood to come into contact with a law enforcement officer and in what may happen after that contact occurs. They need training in racial and economic disparities, helping skills when they do interact with individuals in the community that need help, learning how to engage in empathic listening in really complicated situations, and also in compassion fatigue and burnout, and how their own experience of seeing the same very complicated situations day in and day out can reduce their ability to feel compassion for individuals and influence their decision making. These are just a few of the core areas that I believe federal policy pass-through funding should be tied to in terms of standardized training with law enforcement officers. Finally, similar to what Senator Van Hollen raised is, or not finally, sorry, this is my third of my fourth recommendation, is that we need to invest in alternative first responders like social workers. We need a strong, robust public health system that can respond to social problems, that can respond to crises, and that can respond to issues that do not directly impact public safety in that moment. And now finally, my fourth policy recommendation is that we must invest in a research base in police interventions and police social work collaboration interventions. Because this is a life and death situation, as we unfortunately continue to experience, we cannot continue to make policy decisions based on anecdotal evidence or best guesses. And the only way we're going to have robust research is if there's substantially more investment into that research. And that research should explore things like the impact of training officers on implicit bias or racism or trauma, and how their changes in decision-making and behavior may occur. It should research stigma around receipt of trauma treatment and mental health treatment, both for themselves and for citizens. It should research the ability of implicit bias trainings on reducing disparities in our interactions, law enforcement's interactions with citizens. And it should research ways in which law enforcement and social work collaborations could actually improve community well-being, particularly racial equity. Thank you. I think you're on mute.
Eric Jackson.
Oh, there you go. So thank you, Mr. Lewis. Thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity. I just got to say that I'm going to try and use every second of my 8 minutes, if I can, not because I feel like I know everything about this issue, but honestly, because I feel like over the last 12 years, I've been fortunate enough to sit at this intersection of social work and criminal justice. And it's almost like in this time, I feel like I have this amazing secret, but I can't yell loud enough for anyone to really hear me fully. So this is a great opportunity, but also if in this time you hear nothing else that I say, I really want to encourage folks to know that this connection of social work and law enforcement, it can work. I've literally watched it work over the last 12 years. It's not perfect. It's not easy. It's not a magic solution, but it can work. And quite honestly, it has to work. So for me, I'm a social worker who became a police officer that now helps to run a police agency. As Mr. Lewis said, I'm the Director of Community Engagement at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office here in Michigan. I know a lot of times people look and say, you know, how is that possible to go from social work to law enforcement? But thanks to Mr. Patterson, I'm not by myself and folks like him. I'll just say this, that the professions, although we think of them on opposite ends of the spectrum, I really get to spend a lot of my time working where they overlap in those intersections. And I often share stories around how, as a social worker, I really focus on working with the most vulnerable populations in our community. And what I learned once I started working at the sheriff's office is that those are the same individuals that our law enforcement officers are dealing with every single day. So when I was a young social worker working at a homeless shelter for teens, what I quickly realized is it wasn't uncommon for an officer to find a runaway or pick up a homeless youth and bring them to our front door of our shelter. Or if you even think about how often or how many times in a week our deputies are responding to a domestic violence call, it is not uncommon for an officer to be the first connection of someone who's been abused and battered, for that survivor to be connected to services. Or even here in Michigan in the winter, when the homeless man is on the side of the street without a place to go, it isn't uncommon for an officer or a deputy to be that first connection to the warming shelter. And so I guess I would just say that even if you look at our jails all across this country, others on the panel have already said this, but our jails are full of those suffering from mental health issues, substance use disorder, are homeless, or simply are poor and can't afford to get out of jail. So regardless of what we think of policing or of the criminal justice system as social workers, I'll just say that our social work values and our core code of ethics, it really implores us to engage with the criminal justice system in a significant way. So I know that during these times of debate and protest around police brutality, when it seems that there is a daily reminder of police violence, it can sometimes seem hopeless or helpless. And I know there is pressure to take immediate action. In my role, trust me, helping to run a police agency, I feel that pressure every single day. I'm in this interesting position in the middle of community and policing, so I hear it on both sides. But what I want to encourage us to do is to be thoughtful. We didn't get here yesterday, and we're not going to get out of this tomorrow. So these shallow promises or rash decisions for a quick change without real understanding of structures and systems and how we get here, quite honestly, I think will only prove to fail, but at best won't really allow us to get to the real change I think that we all desire. So one of the analogies that I use is, if you think about any large structure or skyscraper, for any building that you want to tear down, you need just as many architects to demolish it as you did to build it in the first place, right? You can't just run in, throw a bunch of dynamite all over the place and then hit detonate. You really got to understand the structure and the architecture, the strengths, the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities. You need to create those alternative structures to move things into before you ever set that first stick of dynamite. So to me, it doesn't really matter if people are coming to this discussion around defunding or deconstructing or abolishing or subtle reforms. What matters for any of those paths to be successful is first understanding the current system. And if you understand that system, what you will know is that simply embedding social workers isn't just about a program or having social workers respond to a mental health call in place of an officer. That's a part of it. It's a big part of it. But it's much more complex than that. Social work is a philosophy. It's the way we think about the world and the work that we do. It's the way we think about the people that we serve. And I know, and I've heard this, people have asked me this question around the worry of social workers being co-opted by law enforcement, about working too close. And that's a legitimate concern, but one that I think can be navigated with the appropriate structures if we put them in place. So social workers have just as much to learn about functioning in, engaging with, and changing the criminal justice system from the inside out as officers do and learn about social work values. So we don't want or need social workers to carry tasers. In fact, my sheriff took my taser away as soon as I became a police officer. And we don't want police officers to be social workers. But I think we do want to take at least a small bit of social work philosophy in the way we operate and infuse it into the criminal justice system, into policing. So we want to ask the right questions, think about solving problems, not just about making arrests, understand the communities that they work in. And if nothing else, social work education teaches us to understand ourselves and our own personal bias. So it's important to have advocates marching in the streets, but if as social workers we only push from the outside, those who want the system to remain as it is will simply build stronger walls. So however, if some of us get on the inside, start to make change from within, we can open that door and invite our friends in to help us make that change. And so that's really what I want to implore folks to do and to think about, is how social workers can be willing to get involved. So in my role as an administrator, it's more than just running a few feel-good programs, right? It's about designing systems, creating structures, providing tools, and changing the very nature of law enforcement. So yes, at our agency, we have revamped our training, as others have listed out. We now spend just as much time training on things like implicit bias and procedural justice and managing mental health crisis and on and on and on as we do around the force continuum. So we're giving our officers the tools to do the work that we really want them to do. So yes, we have changed the type of competencies we're looking for when we go to hire an officer. Yes, we have internal systems of quality control and quality assurance so that we catch things before they ever become these big red flags. And yes, we've changed numerous policies. I spend too much time looking at our policies. But we are also changing the basic assumptions that drive our officers. So it's these assumptions that fuel our values, and those values that influence our beliefs. And it's those beliefs that drive the individual behavior of the officers on the street. And I think this is where social work can thrive, and the level of depth and understanding that we need to have when we're talking about that intersection of social work and criminal justice, or social work in particular in law enforcement. So again, I want to stress that yes, we do a lot of programs. I would talk about our programs all day long, but I think it's also even deeper than just the programs. It's the fundamental shift of the meaning of what law enforcement is and the connection to community. So yeah, we've created a lot of those programs, right? We have a 24/7 crisis line, so community can call, but also officers can call. So when an officer now, and they've been trained in mental health kind of triage, but when they respond to a scene, if it turns out that it's a mental health call, we have community mental health workers that are on call 24/7, 365. Our officers tell dispatch to dispatch the social worker out, and the social worker takes over. And for some who might think, well, are law enforcement really interested in that? I'll just tell you, if you're responding to a mental health call over and over and over and you're not trained in it, and you can hand that off to an expert as an officer, you will definitely take advantage of that. Our community not too long ago passed a public safety and mental health millage here in Washington County about 2 years ago. So it's the only one in Michigan like it. And I say that because our community values that intersection of criminal justice and social work, and basically put their money where their mouth is, right? And so not just talking about it, but allowing us to have the resources to actually braid these systems together and create these structures to change the very nature of our local criminal justice system. And I think that's what social work lens and value can really bring to this overall conversation around policing. One of the questions I really wanted to hit on is kind of what did I need when I first embarked on this journey? I never wanted to be a police officer growing up. I grew up in a community where we didn't get along with officers. The neighborhood that I live in now, there was a man back in 2006 that was killed at the hands of the same agency that I worked for. And I was one of the individuals marching in the streets. But my father said to me when this opportunity arose that you often talk about changing law enforcement. You're marching in the street about changing law enforcement. How about you get in there and you actually do something about it? And so I really want to implore folks to think about that. And one of the things that I really wish that I had, I just didn't have the opportunity years ago when I was in school, was really to learn more about the criminal justice system. Mr. Patterson spoke about those universities that are doing some of that great work. I think that is just so important. And so before we ever think about embedding a social worker or partnering a social worker with a law enforcement agency, I think it's really important to make sure our social work peers have the competency to do that work. A lot of my interns, as they come through, I can watch. Some are really good with working within systems and some are not. And sometimes within our schools, we're actually teaching folks to break down the systems, tear down the system, but we're teaching them in a way to do it outside versus inside. And those are a difference. So it's not meant for everybody. But for some, there is a role to play. And then the last piece I'll just mention of what I think I learned in social work was early on in school, I learned that criminal justice and social work were sometimes seen as the opposite ends of the spectrum. So many of us kind of come into the field thinking that. And when I was back at this homeless shelter for teenagers, I remember so many times we made an effort to keep the officers away from the young people in the shelter. And I understand why, right? We gotta have these clear boundaries to separate the two. But now that I think back on it, I wish I could redo it. Because even though I was thinking I was protecting the young people at that shelter from officers, Now, when I think back, when I went home to go to sleep at night, guess who was out on the streets? Those young people and those officers. And I feel like I wasn't really preparing those young people, not only to know how to navigate with the officers, but just as importantly, helping our officers in our local community understand the community and the young people that they were working with. So I know for many of us, the social work, we think about our helping is building these walls sometimes to keep police away from communities that we care for. But instead, as social workers, what I would argue is, how about we actually become that bridge that helps bring the community and law enforcement together? Things definitely need to change. And I would just say, if not us in social work to bring folks together and really help the systems to change from the inside out, then I don't know who else could do it. Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Patterson. I'm sorry, Dr. Patton. Dr. Patton.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, and for everyone who is responsible for bringing us all together. Proactive policing strategies and multiple forms of police misconduct and violence have disproportionately affected people of color. One relatively new strategy is social media monitoring. Police are increasingly monitoring social media to build evidence for criminal indictments. Justification of this behavior is rooted in historical narratives and a belief structure often perpetuated in the criminal justice system that views Black people as symbolic assailants. Many researchers warn that these covert and routine strategies have widespread cumulative effects on both individuals and the collective consciousness of Black communities. Given what we know, it is important to note that the use of social media to predict criminal activity is dangerous. Ruha Benjamin calls modern police surveillance the new Jim Code because there are biases within the algorithms of these technologies. One must ask, are police culturally equipped to understand the nuanced linguistic styles communicated on social media? Sociologists suggest that many youth and young adults who live in neighborhoods with high rates of violence may project a tough image or follow a code of the street in their community to stay safe and protected. Could the same be true online? Does an individual who talks about drugs and violence on social media actually engage in these activities? And then we must ask, should social media be used at all within the criminal justice system? Police agencies use social media for a variety of reasons. Data from the International Associations of Chiefs of Police suggests that 96% of police agencies use social media in some capacity. The most common use of social media is for criminal investigations. Police officers find evidence or additional information about a missing or wanted person, gang participation, or web-based crimes such as cyber stalking or cyberbullying. The police may perform a manual search on a social media platform or request specific information from social media platforms. In some instances, the police may also install software on targeted individual computers and perform analysis on social media data that have been captured. Social media is also used for community outreach and information sharing. Online policing practices are formed from a multiplicity of technologies available to various agencies. These technologies provide a wide spectrum of access to social media content with differing relation between the police, social media users, and those who manage the platforms. One's visibility on social media and communication of everyday experiences, practices, and activities provides the perfect platform for covert criminal surveillance by the police. To that end, social media monitoring reduces transparency and increases the power imbalance in police work. Daniel Trottier refers to these strategies as social media policing, and that these new tactics represent a new paradigm for profiling and preemptive policing. The idea is that social media is viewed as a utility for crime reduction, investigatory purposes, and production of evidence, all uses that are well outside the intended purview of why social media was created. Importantly, while room for these uses are regularly included in terms of service agreements, investigations by law enforcement officials on social media violates users' reported privacy expectations. Social media policing requires that social media users monitor their own output and that of their network, as close network connections and relationships may become liabilities if output is deemed problematic by law enforcement. The reality is the arrangement benefits the police. The very platforms that amplify user visibility allow police to act invisibly, eradicating any notions of mutual transparency. The issue lies in the ways in which we encode social media communication. The encoding of social media communication happens when a post is written and the interpretations of said post are to be understood by the members of the intended audience. So let's talk briefly about a few examples of when social media is used incorrectly. The case of Dylan Roof underscores how the power of prejudice affects who is surveilled online. In June 2015, Roof, a young white man, walked into the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, a historically Black church, and shot 9 people to death. Until this act, Ruth had not been on law enforcement's radar in spite of a public social media presence, including a manifesto of racial hatred and murderous intent. Ruth is an example of a domestic terrorist whose public performance of self on social media was conveniently neutralized by his race. In addition, social media has become a prime source for government surveillance. Recently, the FBI leveraged data from an Etsy review, a LinkedIn profile, Instagram videos, and a few Google searches to identify a masked woman accused of setting 2 police cars on fire during recent protests in Philadelphia. The most recent incident underscores the misuse of social media and other publicly available online records to identify protesters during the Black Lives Matter movement. And just last week, faulty facial recognition systems leveraged by the Detroit police led to the wrongful arrest of Robert Julian Borchek Williams for a crime he did not commit. I think there's hope if we can develop ethical and humane ways of leveraging social media for social good. This is where I think social workers are most needed in the unbundling of social media from police work. First, social workers should consider and be aware of social media as a digital environment, a digital representation of human behavior in the social environment. Understanding the virtual world as the world may identify new understandings of the contextual factors that may inform how we understand crime. Second, social work training must incorporate how to leverage social media for social good, and our code of ethics should guide us when not to use social media. This includes how to talk to clients and communities about social media use and identifying best practices for leveraging social media as data for intervention. New social work thinking can encourage culturally nuanced and appropriate ways of using social media that can focus on identifying community strengths or signals that indicate harm or trauma that can be leveraged to prevent crime. Third, social workers can help to determine when social media is appropriate to use when acting as translators and blind spotters. Social workers can support identifying and bringing the appropriate domain expertise to the use of social media in the criminal justice system. This means social workers help to create opportunities, paid opportunities, where community members give voice to how social media policing impacts their community, identifying opportunities and challenges. And lastly, a core principle is for social workers to help people in need and address social problems. In the case of my lab's research on gun violence and mass incarceration, these 2 social problems share roots in inequality, racism, and poverty. However, we had to pause and rethink how we use social media towards preventing gun violence. By listening to youth, we learned that an approach that leverages social media must anticipate how these social problems intersect and the impact the use of social media may have on preventing or extending these problems. Another core value of social work is understanding the importance of human relationships. Before I ask if social media is the right tool for policing, I must engage in extensive and critical conversations with communities in gun violence where gun violence is an issue, and work with them to better understand how the problem is defined by the community. This is the social work difference. Thank you.
Thank you. So all of our presenters have had a very interesting experience in this field. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Patton, because one of the reasons I wanted you to be on this panel is because social media is not usually thought about in terms of the how we engage communities and policing. What are the implications? Like we have social workers watching, but we also have legislative staffers, and what are some of the implications your work or this information may have in terms of federal legislation? Because policing is generally a local issue, but are there any things that the federal government might do that would mitigate some of the concerns you have?
Yes, we need to work on developing technology policies that are ethical and that are humane and that allow for some guardrails with the use of social media in the criminal justice system. Listen, what I'm most concerned about is the extent to which misinterpretation of social media communication can lead to a new form of mass incarceration. If we do not consider that our context, that we may not have the correct lens, the correct frames for interpreting social media communication, the response can be detrimental, in particular for the Black and Brown community, as we see most of the surveillance that's happening is centered along Black Lives Matter movements and communities that are composed of Black and Brown individuals.
Okay, before we move on, I'd like to give our other panelists an opportunity to respond to that, to what Dr. Patterson has presented. Anybody? So, go ahead.
Mr. Lewis, I really appreciate Dr. Patton bringing that up, because I'll just tell you from an everyday law enforcement perspective, social media is one of the go-to tools now, right? And so if you're talking about really changing the trajectory of policing, you look at some of the tools that are, some of the emerging tools that are being used. And so I won't say much more than that. We can get to some of the other questions, but I do think it is a very relevant piece that oftentimes we just aren't very much aware of, just because of the nature of modern day policing and how policing is being done these days.
I think also, Dr. Lewis, if you don't mind if I chime in too, what Dr. Patton points out is what we see in the policing of other types of behavior, where people of color are differently policed than white individuals. So statistically, depending on the different crime categories, there's no differences in criminal behavior, but there are differences in arrests that are, biased towards people of color. And I think what Dr. Patton's research is showing is he's finding that exact same pattern playing out in social media. And I think that's really important parallel to draw too, is like, this isn't a new pattern. It's a new platform for the same pattern to be repeated.
Yeah, so it's definitely something that we need to think about when we're considering this whole notion of improving how our communities are dealt with in terms of response to the needs. Dr. Patterson, is there special training that police social workers need in order to do this work? Music. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for that question. Yeah, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, in schools of social work, there's no specific police social work training that is offered. And also, unfortunately, as Mr. Jackson was mentioning, not a lot of police departments actually hire police social workers. So one of the things that we need to think about going forward is this rich 100-year history that we already have, is to think about not only models of intervention for 911 calls, but also models of training.
Okay, there are a number of ways social workers can work in tandem with the police in order to have safe and protected communities. Are there any that you have a particular? And of course, Sheriff Jackson, you have that life experience. But any other models that you may have seen that you think are effective? Any one of the panelists?
Go ahead, Dr. Patterson.
Anyone?
So I'll just jump in and say, again, the way that I look at it is social work is kind of all of the above, right? It's the philosophy, it's the thought, it's the administrative level, it's the cultural shift. We often forget about, when we're talking about policing, the impact that it has on jails as well in our local community. So it's about reentry, recidivism. So from subtle, small questions in our jail, we never ask questions around, if you see someone who comes into your jail 11 times, what's the real reason behind why they came into jail 11 times? If they're in a local jail 11 times, if they were violent, they'd be going off to prison already, right? They're in the local jail for these small crimes. And I think a couple of other folks have pointed this out. Many are there because of mental health issues or substance use disorder or homelessness. And so just the social worker being at the table to ask that question changed how we think about the way and the nature and the services that we provide in our jail. So the same thing around policing, just being there to ask the question of, okay, this crime keeps happening in this particular area over and over and over. What's the problem behind it? Not just the crime. I'll give you an example. We had a lot of business owners in one of our downtown areas who were really upset around this prostitution corridor. And so folks would set up stings and they just arrest folks over and over and over and let them out. What we started asking was, wait a minute, why are primarily women, why are these women prostituting in this area? And every single one of them, Mr. Lewis, that we asked over a 2-year period was because of addiction. So as a social worker, we're not worried about just making the arrest. We wanted to find out what's the real root cause of the problem. So now we started to develop systems in place to help the women deal with addiction, not just lock them up and throw them in jail. And so it may seem like a small question, but it's a fundamental shift to law enforcement to ask a different question around the problem versus the arrest. And then they start thinking differently about the people that they're working with. It's not just about crime. It's about humanizing and understanding individuals. So I could go on and on about it, but I think just having a social worker's voice at the table to be able to ask those questions, and I really do have to stress this, law enforcement is a hierarchical kind of an organization. And I think for my sheriff, Sheriff Clayton, to put me high up in the organization as a director, I don't want to short sell that. Because what he said to me was, if I put you at the same level, say, as a deputy, they could just ignore you, right? Or you would do a few things, or you just become the special project on the side. But really to put some power and authority behind the work and the things that we're talking about in social work values, not just as a small unit on the side.
Can I comment on that, Dr. Lewis? I think what Dr. Jackson's talking about too is really highlighting this notion that even if we come up with alternative first responders to law enforcement, there's always going to be some difficulty in disentangling public health and public safety issues where they'll intersect on the same scene. So law enforcement ultimately does need an awareness of helping principles and social work principles and vice versa. But Dr. Patterson, I believe that you've written about, there were proposals around social work and police cross education as far back as 1920, right? Where they were talking about the importance for police to understand institutional racism, human behavior, mental health, all the things that we talked about earlier, as well as social workers to understand the role of law enforcement and the administration of law or justice. So I think there's, I've seen universities propose dual degrees in social work and policing, which might be a really nice model to look into as well.
So there's this one model that has been adopted by Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I believe Newark, New Jersey is also doing. They're setting it. They're going to take 10% of the police budget and create a entity in the community that will respond to non-enforcement issues. So that in a sense that entity becomes first responders. What can social workers do as first responders that the police shouldn't be doing? I mean, we know the obvious things, but like domestic violence.
I'm trying not to jump in first. I got a ton to say, so I'm happy.
I know, me too, but you go first. You go first, and then I'll say some things.
I'll make a comment on two parts of it. I think part of it is not to underestimate also changing the community's behavior. I think I referenced that because people naturally call 911 for a lot of things that they don't have to call 911 for right now. So creating those alternative systems, but also helping as a community to think about, well, wait, why am I calling 911 for someone who's in a mental health crisis when I do have a 24/7 crisis line to get a social worker to come out? That already exists. So changing some of that behavior, I think, is important. I just wanted to touch on the funding piece, and then I'll get to your question as well, is that, so in our community, again, defunding or changing the funding structure is not something new or scary for us. I'll reference the millage. So we weren't trying to have this race to the bottom where it's a singular decision. We got to take from police to give to human services. We actually were trying to build up both systems at the same time, right? So to be able to really educate and provide resources, yes, on the law enforcement side, to do the work that Dr. Pettis-Davis talked about when those sections overlap, but also to really build up our community mental health structures. And so having the resources to do that, I think, are definitely needed. So when you're, again, are trying to deconstruct something, you have to have those alternative structures. If we just say law enforcement is no longer going to respond to A, B, C, and D, we best have a really good alternative, right? We really need to have a really good alternative. So yes, policing may not be the best answer, but if we don't have an alternative and a really good answer, I think we do wind up having other kinds of issues that really pop up. So I agree with you, Mr. Lewis, and your question is, there are some models out there that are refunding, but I think inevitably what they're really trying to get to is, it isn't the tool, I say, that is bad. It is how the tool has been used, which is bad, right? And so if we really start to separate out where we need to separate out, get people to the right places where they need to go to, but in those overlapping pieces, make sure officers have the right tools and the resources. To me, I think that's the proper step to take, where you can do it both and versus one or the other.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
I was just going to use the example of crisis stabilization units, which is one of the areas that we research in, which is where law enforcement has the option to take a person who's in psychiatric crisis to an acute mental health treatment facility. Oftentimes it's only 72 hours though. So to answer part A of your question is, so alternative responders, social workers specifically, can provide treatment for mental health and substance use disorders that may be increasing the likelihood of coming into contact with law enforcement. But also to Derek's point is, people also need to, those alternatives need to be high quality and actually effective. So 72 hours isn't necessarily going to stabilize anybody for longer than 72 hours. So we have to invest the resources in those being effective, high quality alternatives. And in my early research with law enforcement, is some of the things that they're saying is, we have this crisis stabilization unit, but nobody gets any better than when we take them there. So why would I invest the resources and the time to take these individuals there when they don't, from their perception, don't do any better than they do if they take them to jail?
So I want to ask Dr. Patton. Yeah, I was about to come to you, Dr. Patton, to say if we do have that entity in the community that's going to, I say, replace the police, but at least supplement. Is there a role for technology, social media in that?
Well, first, I just want to take a step back and go back to the question that's been being discussed, and I think we need to consider the framings and the paradigms that go into this decision making in the first place. And what I'm concerned about, and what we're not really talking about, is kind of the unlearning of white supremacy that also needs to happen in tandem with the tools that are developed, the alternative strategies that need to be in place as well. And so I think as we are considering all of these great ideas, that at the forefront and at the core of these conversations need to be unlearning white supremacy, because that's going to inform how you treat the community, how you determine which behavior gets which treatment. But is there a role for technology? I think that that's a question that should be decided in an interdisciplinary space, right? That I don't think that there's one entity that should decide when and how social media is used. And I think the problem has been that there have been a lot of decision makers that are using social media in inappropriate ways. And even in my own lab, we have struggled with how do we tell the most robust stories, the most ethical stories using social media. And we have had to do our own unlearning of white supremacist framing in that process. And so I think that, what I would like to see is a culmination and a coalition of police officers and community members and social workers who are thinking together and centering and privileging the voices of those community members to make those decisions. Because I'm not sure that I should be using social media, but I would love to hear from community members about the integration of these tools in their community.
Okay, we're about to wind down our briefing, but so I want to give each of you an opportunity to have a last word, so to speak. And I want you to, since this is a congressional briefing, what issues do legislators need to zero in on as they think about expanding social workers' involvement in this space? Who wants to start?
I'm not starting. I'll somebody else has to start.
Okay, Dr. Patterson, we haven't heard from you lately. Why don't you jump in there and
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Dr. Lewis. So I'll get it started. I think, as I said before, the social work profession has a rich 100-year history of involvement in law enforcement. So I think that we have a lot of knowledge and skills, as Volmer first mentioned 100 years ago, to bring to reforming police departments and rethinking and reimagining policing. There are also social workers such as myself that train police officers and actually go into the academy and train recruits. We also train veteran police officers. So there also needs to be like a train the trainer, training social workers to train police officers and recruits. Sometimes it's not an easy task, but it is very rewarding and it's very much needed. And just to finish up and conclude, it's like I said before, what's different this time, 100 years later, is that now we have social workers with this paramilitary police experience in both the police academy and police departments. And then also to give a shout out to the FBI, there's also social workers in the FBI.
So I'll jump in.
go ahead.
I think that what I hear as a common thread is the need for the federal government to redefine who gets to be an expert in this space. And what this very prestigious panel has illuminated is that social workers have a long history and a lot of knowledge that can be a healthy contribution to hopefully disrupting how we think about policing in the 21st century. And so I am hopeful that we will now integrate these ideas, not only from social workers and from social work researchers, but from the communities that we are all embedded in, and uplift those voices to be a part of the solution.
Dr. Pettis Davis. We can't hear you.
Now I'm unmuted. There? Okay. I got muted earlier. I was talking too much. No, I'm just kidding. So the themes that I've heard throughout today is that there needs to be incremental, thoughtful change that is evidence-driven and evaluative. There may be some areas where we don't have any evidence yet, and we need to continue to evaluate our interventions. And I would add to that a key component of that evaluation needs to be that any reform approaches or any collaboration approaches effectively promote racial equality and reduce racial disparities throughout our communities. The second thing that I heard is that it's another key component to improving community well-being and reducing racial and economic disparities is that we have to look for ways to effectively create and promote public health, because when we effectively create and promote public health, then we reduce the need for public safety interventions, and police can actually focus on law enforcement in the true sense of the way, instead of being forced to police actual public health issues. And then the final thing that I heard is that, well, I keep saying final, but I really have two more. So the second to the final thing that I heard is that we really need cross-disciplinary training. That both professions have a lot to learn. Both professions need to be self-evaluative in their interactions with each other, and we need to understand each other's language. And the final thing was that there's really no silver bullet, right? There's a need for a comprehensive overhaul that doesn't just use one intervention approach. That's all.
You're muted, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you much. So I'm looking at my clock and I said we have just a little more time than I had anticipated. So I'm gonna, so we covered your advice for the legislators. I just want you to.
Wait, Mr. Lewis, can I just offer a couple? I didn't get a chance to actually offer a couple of the.
Did you? Oh, did I? I'm sorry. I forgot you did.
First, I should have just. So I did just want to mention a couple things. I'm glad you asked the question about specific to legislators. I think if there's some way to incentivize both internally and externally this work, I think that's a huge way. So I don't have a clear-cut way of how to incentivize, but financial incentives are an important way to do that, both on the community side to think about social workers and the community getting involved in the criminal justice system, but also to incentivize within law enforcement. So I often say that this is what I do for a living. Like I literally get to sit within the sheriff's office and think about these kinds of issues every day, all day. I get to push our agency, sometimes bump my head and fall down, but sometimes get back up and really push us in a positive direction. So I do feel like the more agencies that have that voice or that conscience internally, because the stuff that we were talking about, Dr. Patton brought up, a lot of these programs and issues will help, right? Folks from mental health and things like that. But in this case, that would not have helped Mr. Floyd, right? And so we really need to be changing some of the things that Dr. Patton was illuminating for us. Yes, we need all these other programs, but there's all these other things that I think intrinsically within law enforcement that we know exist, and how do we actually change those? So I'll just give a very specific example around maybe one way. So in our agency, we took drug forfeiture is always the controversial thing. So our sheriff said, you know what? A certain percentage of drug forfeiture dollars that come into our agency every year is going back into community engagement. So using the same money that we would take, not to buy new guns or cars, but using that money to help redirect funds into substance use disorder treatment, or helping to do some community engagement stuff. So one of the things I would say to some of the legislators on the call is, both at the federal and the state level, that drug forfeiture legislation and policy can be really restrictive, that even an agency like us that might want to use those dollars to do other things can't be done. And so it really limits how we could use that. So that would be one very specific one. And then the other thing that I think is important is social work, but also peers. Like, how do you get these civilians or people with lived experience? There are a lot of really good social workers that have lived experience with the system, but they cannot work, or they're restricted from work and are limited in doing this work, but they are probably some of the best experts around. And so legislation to really change that, to allow for folks to be able to work in a police agency. They don't have to have access to like law enforcement terminals and all those things, but making it easier to hire folks, I think at the local policy level, but also at the legislative level.
Okay, so as we close, we've given some advice to the legislators. Just tell me what one important thing social workers need to be thinking when they move into this space. I'm a social worker and I'm thinking I'm going to go into community work. I mean, you would think that they would need both micro and macro skills if they're going to go into that space, and non-social workers might not understand that. I mean, more direct services versus community organizing skills. But what are one important thing that we really must consider as we move into that space?
I'm going to steal yours, Dr. Lewis. I think is that it's not to come in with we're a fixer or a savior kind of orientation, you know, to understand the nuance and the complications, and I don't know, just not come in like we're going to save everything and fix the police.
Yeah, I would say I think it's a great one, but I would also say to check your biases at the door. I came into this work thinking a certain way about policing, and I would say it's just like the analogy I use is like if you're a social worker and you're working with a mom who abused or neglected her kid, you might remove that kid for a time period, and you might have disdain for what that mother did to that child, but you're always working to reunify that family. And help that mom who may have done some horrible things to be better. And so around law enforcement, I think the same way. We know there's been some atrocities there. And we may separate and protect as we can, but ultimately as a social worker, how do you check that your own personal bias against law enforcement to really start to bring folks together?
Dr. Patton, do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts?
number one, I think there should be more social workers involved in tech development. And I think that engagement will have a ripple effect with how social media is used within our society, and in particular in the criminal justice system. So please teach students about technology, learn more about technology, integrate tech into your research and daily practice in some capacity. But what I really appreciate about being a social worker is that my values matter, and that I can bring those values everywhere I go, and they are up for discussion and they can be integrated. And so continue to uplift those values in the spaces that you enter.
Thank you. And Dr. Patterson, seems you get the last word on this one.
Okay, I would say that social workers are very familiar with working in host settings like schools, hospitals. Working in a law enforcement setting is kind of similar to military social work. One of the things we have to think about as we move into this space is working in a paramilitary organization where there is a very strict chain of command. And we also have to be comfortable where we are working with others that are armed and have access to guns and other weaponry. That can make a lot of social workers uncomfortable.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank our panelists for a very lively and informative discussion. And as we draw to a close, we're going to have a few words from Dr. Angelo Mclain, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Association of Social Workers. Dr. Mclain?
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I'm just sitting here so excited to hear the panel. I thank all of you for sharing your expertise and your knowledge, and it's just interesting. The planners did a good job of putting together social work education, social work practice, social work research, and social work technology. And then we have you, Dr. Lewis, bringing up the political social work end of things. And I think what I can contribute to this is, is sort of the advocacy piece that NASW can bring to this space, and then also the professional development part. But just, Dr. Patterson, you talked about our rich 100-year history. I want to call you Commander Jackson, but Director Jackson, just the day-to-day nuts and bolts, the in and out, not only at a micro level, in the field, but then at a meso level, designing the programs and the solutions, and then, at a macro level, and showing the way. And Dr. Pettis Davis, the research that you mentioned, and just a reminder that we want to, all these things we implement, want to have it through a lens of achieving social justice and social equity. And Dr. Patton, when you talk about, social media and how that could be another way of a form of mass incarceration, and that we really need to be down with the technology to bring that in, that can bring those things. I think the one thing I heard loud and clear from all of you is that there's an alternative response, whether it's a 911 call, a 211 call, whatever it is. But not only is there an alternative response, we know how to do this. We have been doing this. We can learn how to do more of it, how to do it better. There's a need for an insider approach and an outsider approach. I think back to Whitney Young, back in the 60s, he was sometimes criticized because he had an insider approach. He said, I want to be in the boardroom. I want to be in the White House. Whitney knew, personally knew 3 presidents, and they called on him. So, and we do need within our profession that insider approach and the outsider approach. And we know when we say there's a role for social workers within law enforcement, we're not in any way saying that there isn't a need for reform, and in some places radical reform. We know that need's there. I'm so glad you guys talked about the unpacking, white supremacy and how that framing permeates, and we need to make sure that we're addressing that. I had worked in child welfare, for 2 decades, and and I like what you said, Dr. Patterson, about we work in a lot of host settings, because whether it's in hospitals, schools, working in child welfare, and oftentimes I might get a call from an officer saying, could you meet me at such and such address? Or I might call them and say, can you meet me at such and such address? And we always had each other's back. We could sort of move in and out. Maybe I was taking the lead one time and then they were taking the lead the next time. But we know how to do this work. And I'm so glad you guys are setting the examples and providing the leadership. And that as a profession, we're positioned in this moment. Many of us have really longed for years to be on the nightly news, to have the president say social workers in an executive order. Here this moment is, and you guys have been on this path for years, preparing the way and paving the way for social work. So I see this as a moment, Dr. Lewis, when our profession is, we're more than ready. We're ready, willing, and able to address this thing from so many angles, and not to give up on our ultimate goal, to have a more humane and just society. So I'm honored to share the stage with you guys. With that, Dr. Lewis, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you much. And we want to thank everyone who joined us for this discussion. And we want to hear from you. So we've created an email account just to hear from our audience. socialwork.policing@gmail.com. socialwork.policing@gmail.com. We want to hear your comments, your thoughts, where we could do better, where we maybe some issues we didn't get to cover, but we do want to hear from you. And the sponsors would like to thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee and the Congressional Social Work Caucus, Congresswoman Karen Bass, and Senator Chris Van Hollen for supporting this effort. And I need to say that Congresswoman Lee and Congresswoman Bass are social workers. So we're always happy to work with them. And I would like to thank our planning and production team, Dr. Michael Sherrodden and Lisa Johnson at the Center for Social Development, Sarah Butts and Rafael Vitali at NASW, Yasmin Campos Mendez and Fahana Shafi at CRISP. So again, we thank you for coming. We had I think this was a very fruitful discussion. It is being videotaped and it will be available on the Center for Social Development website, NASW's website, and CRIF's website. So until we meet again, we want to encourage everyone to stay safe and wear your mask. Thank you much.